when music was a number. A History of a Philosophical Misunderstanding by J.C. Graziano. Prologue. Before the sound. There is a question human beings have been asking for at least 2,500 years. A deceptively simple question, the kind that looks like it should have been settled long ago, perhaps over a glass of wine in ancient Athens. And yet, here we are. The question is this: what is music? Not a trivial question, not a parlor game. It has driven philosophers, mathematicians, theologians, composers, and scientists into obsession, contradiction, and occasional brilliance for 25 centuries. It has reshaped the way the Western world thinks about art, science, the cosmos, and the nature of the human soul. And the answers, if we can call them that, have never agreed with each other. Quite the opposite. Each historical era has produced its own answer. And these answers have collided, often spectacularly, producing a history that is less a steady progress toward truth than a long, fascinating argument that nobody has managed to win. That argument is what this audiobook is about. This audiobook begins as a doctoral thesis in philosophy, defended at the University of Florence in November 1999. The original title was sober, nearly academic: The Philosophy of Music, from Pythagoreanism to contemporary analytic aesthetics. The scope was ambitious, starting from Pythagoras, the Greek thinker who, in the 6th century BC, first understood that music is made of numbers, and arriving at the analytic philosophy of music of the 1980s and 1990s. 2,500 years, not a short trip. But across that entire journey, one opposition keeps returning. It changes names, changes costume, adapts to each era's vocabulary, yet its substance never changes. It is a tension as old as Western civilization itself. To describe it, we need a precise point of reference. In 1872, Friedrich Nietzsche publishes The Birth of Tragedy. His thesis: Western civilization is traversed by an irresolvable tension between two principles, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Apollo, god of light and form, is the principle of order, measure, beautiful appearance. Dionysus, god of ecstasy and wine, is the principle of excess, of the primordial force that dissolves the boundaries of the individual. Nietzsche does not ask us to choose between them. Great art is born from their tension, not from the victory of one over the other. This dialectical pair is extraordinarily useful. But for the philosophy of music, it has one precise limitation. Apollo does not play. Apollo is the god of celestial harmony, of visible proportion, of sculpture and poetry. He is an excellent metaphor for the arts of space. But for music, an art that exists in time, that is produced with the body, that obeys mathematical laws, and at the same time moves us, Apollo remains too distant from concrete sonic experience. That is why, in this book, Apollo is replaced by Orpheus. Not an arbitrary substitution, a philosophical clarification. Orpheus is the musician of Greek myth. He plays the lyre, sings, uses his voice, reasons. He knows the mathematical laws of sound and inhabits them from within, translating them into melody. Orpheus carries inside himself what Apollo had only contemplated from the outside. This move, Orpheus in place of Apollo, within the Nietzschean pair, is not against Nietzsche. It is with Nietzsche, and one step further, in the specific direction of the philosophy of music. So, back to us. Orpheus against Dionysus, theory against practice, science against art, form against content, reason against feeling. This pair is the thread running through the entire journey. You will encounter it at every stage, each time with a different name, each time in a different costume. But who Orpheus really is, what his precise philosophical function within this dialectic is, will only be revealed at the end. For now, it is enough to know that he is not merely a symbol, he is a category. Before we set off, a word on what this journey is and what it is not. Philosophy of music is not music criticism. It does not rate albums or rank composers. It is not musicology, which traces how musical styles evolved across centuries. Philosophy of music asks stranger, more radical questions. What actually is a musical work? Does it exist before anyone performs it? And if so, where? Is a symphony the marks on a score, the sound of an orchestra, or something more abstract that neither of those things fully captures? When we say a melody is sad, are we saying something true about the music, or merely projecting our own states onto organized vibrations? These questions can sound abstruse, but they are also the questions that make music the most mysterious phenomenon in human culture. Because music, unlike literature or painting, does not represent anything. It tells no stories, it depicts no objects, it carries no declared content, and yet it moves us, transforms us, makes us feel that something larger than ourselves is briefly within reach. How is that possible? What is actually happening when we listen? The answer this audiobook will attempt to build is, at its core, this. The history of the philosophy of music is the history of a repeated, never-concluded attempt to reconcile number and sounding body, to find a bridge between the mathematical structure that music undeniably possesses and the physical, irreducible experience that music inevitably produces. Orpheus is the name of that bridge, not the myth, the category. The original misunderstanding. There is a particular kind of philosophical error, not the gross mistake, the kind you catch quickly, correct, and move on from, but the error that grows out of a right intuition, out of a real discovery, verifiable and fertile, and that consists in generalizing it beyond what the evidence actually supports, in assuming that a partial structure of a phenomenon constitutes its entire nature. The philosophy of music in the West is born from precisely this kind of error. It is born at the moment when the discovery of numerical ratios between musical intervals, a genuine discovery, one that modern acoustic physics has amply confirmed, is transformed into a metaphysical claim. Music is, in its essence, number. Not, music contains numerical structures. Not, music can be described in mathematical terms. Is, proportion, abstract order. In technical terms, this move is called hypostatization. A real property of something is isolated and elevated to substance. The property ceases to be a characteristic of the phenomenon and becomes the phenomenon itself. The number no longer describes music, it constitutes it. This is the original misunderstanding. Not a lie, not a fraud, an excess of abstraction committed in good faith. One step beyond what the evidence authorizes. A step that has defined the boundaries of Western musical thought for over 2,000 years. It is worth understanding the precise, logical form of this leap. Not to refute it, we will encounter its extraordinary fruits at every stage of this history, but to recognize it each time it reappears, even in disguise. The original argument runs as follows. Music produces certain effects on the ear. Those effects depend on numerical ratios between sonic frequencies. Therefore, music, in its deepest nature, is those numerical ratios. The conclusion is technically invalid. From the fact that X depends on Y, it does not follow that X is Y. And yet the conclusion feels irresistible to anyone who has just discovered that cosmic harmony and musical harmony obey the same laws. The symmetry is too beautiful not to be true. Gadamer would observe, centuries later, that genuine understanding means letting something speak, resisting the temptation to reduce it to what we already know. The Pythagorean misunderstanding is precisely the opposite. A category, the number, is brought to music and declared to exhaust its meaning. Music no longer speaks, it is translated. The result is that music ceases to be an experience to inhabit and becomes an object to calculate. It ceases to be something a living body produces and receives and becomes an abstract structure that a pure mind contemplates. This is a change in ontological status, that is, a change in the kind of reality music is held to be. And this change carries consequences that musical philosophy will spend 2,000 years working through, without ever fully escaping them. A philosophical paradigm does not die when it is refuted. It dies, if it ever does, when it can no longer generate interesting questions. The numerical paradigm of music has never reached that point. Each historical era we will encounter in this book has inherited the Pythagorean problem and reformulated it in its own language. Medieval theology translated it into sacred cosmology, the music of the spheres as a reflection of divine harmony. Romantic aesthetics inverted it, replaced number with feeling, but kept the structure of the problem intact. That is, the question of what the essence of music is, independent of the experience of whoever plays or listens to it. 20th century analytic philosophy, which considers itself far removed from Pythagorean mysticism, reproduced the same structure when it asked, what exactly is a musical work? A score? An abstract logical type? A class of historically situated performances? The answers differ, but the question still presupposes that there is a definable entity, something that can be isolated, classified, identified independently of concrete sonic experience. The number has vanished from the surface. The structure of the problem has remained. Contemporary neuroscience, when it studies music as computational processing in the brain, is still, unknowingly, searching for the number inside the sound. This is not a criticism, it is an observation. The paradigm is fertile, it produces results, but it carries with it a blind spot that is transmitted from generation to generation. To see where the blind spot of the numerical paradigm hides, we need to return to the pair introduced in the prologue, Orpheus and Dionysus. And we need to be more precise about the nature of this pair. Orpheus and Dionysus are not simply two opposing symbols. They are a dialectical pair in the sense Hegel would give to that expression. Two terms that define each other, that cannot exist without each other, and whose tension neither finds nor should find a final synthesis that cancels both. In Hegel, dialectic is not a contest between opposites with a winner. It is the movement of thought that generates itself through that tension. Applied to music, Orpheus and Dionysus are not two alternative answers to the question, what is music? They are the two forces whose interaction produces the question itself. The blind spot of the numerical paradigm is precisely this. In the moment when Pythagoras, or the tradition that bears his name, identifies music with number, he is not simply choosing the Orphic pole of the pair. He is forgetting that this is a choice within a pair. He is treating one of the two poles as if it were the whole of reality. Orpheus no longer opposes Dionysus. Dionysus is declared irrelevant, noisy, inappropriate, and the tension that had generated the question is severed. Every theory of music that Western philosophy has ever produced positions itself, consciously or not, at a specific point in this tension. Closer to Orpheus when it privileges structure, notation, abstraction, ontological definition of the work. Closer to Dionysus when it privileges experience, body, immediate emotion, historical and social context. No theory has ever managed to resolve the pair, because every time it seemed to have done so, the other pole reappeared from an unexpected direction. Who Orpheus really is, his precise philosophical function, his actual place within this dialectic, is something this book does not yet reveal. That revelation awaits the final chapter. For now, one thing is enough to hold on to: The pair is not the problem to be solved. It is the condition that keeps music thinkable. Chapter 1. The Number That Sounds. Picture a man walking along a shoreline in Magna Graecia, sometime toward the end of the 6th century BC. His name is Pythagoras. He is holding a string stretched between two pegs. He plucks it. He listens. Then he halves the string and plucks again. The sound he gets is the same, but an octave higher. Exact, crystalline, perfect. And Pythagoras understands something no one before him had understood with such precision. That sound is not arbitrary, that sound obeys a mathematical law. The ratio between the original length and the halved one is 2:1. Always, everywhere, without exception. In that moment, on that shore, the Western philosophy of music is born. But so is something much larger, the conviction that music is, at its deepest level, a mathematical phenomenon. Not an emotion, not an art, not entertainment. A number, a proportion, a law of the universe expressed in sound. This idea is the most revolutionary and the most fertile the history of musical thought has ever produced. It is also, as this audiobook will argue at every turn, the idea that the Western philosophical tradition has progressively, and rather culpably, forgotten. But who exactly were the Pythagoreans? Not simply disciples of a philosopher. Something considerably stranger and more interesting. Around 530 BC, Pythagoras founded a community at Croton, in what is now Calabria, southern Italy, that was simultaneously a political association, a religious brotherhood, a scientific school, and a philosophical circle. A hybrid we would struggle to categorize today, because we are accustomed to keeping those spheres apart. They were not. And this was not naivety. It was a precise philosophical choice. The way of life they practiced had a name: bios theoretikos, the contemplative life. The idea that contemplating the mathematical structure of reality was the highest form of existence available to a human being. Not a bad ambition, as ambitions go. Of Pythagoras himself, we have not a single line in his own hand. He is a figure half submerged in legend, said to be the son of Apollo, to possess a golden thigh, to remember his previous incarnations. The very word philosophy, according to tradition, was coined by him. What we know of his theories comes primarily through Aristotle, who discusses the so-called Pythagoreans in the Metaphysics with a detachment that barely conceals mild irritation. The qualifier so-called is a nice touch. Aristotle is distancing himself from a school that he finds, one suspects, methodologically promiscuous. They mixed mathematics and mysticism in a way that offended his systematic instincts. But that apparent promiscuity concealed a profound intuition. The key discovery, or rediscovery, since some sources trace it to Babylonian and Egyptian antecedents, was this: the principal musical consonances correspond to ratios between small whole numbers. The octave, 2:1, the fifth, 3:2, the fourth, 4:3. All integers, all simple, all, in some hard-to-define sense, beautiful. This was not merely an acoustic curiosity. For the Pythagoreans, it was proof that the entire universe is structured by numerical proportions. Number is not a tool we use to describe reality. Number is reality. And music, with its measurable intervals, is the most direct and tangible manifestation of this cosmic truth. At the center of Pythagorean speculation sits the concept of harmonia, in its original Greek sense, which has nothing to do with what we typically mean by harmony today. For the Pythagoreans, harmonia means the unification of opposites, the idea that two distinct elements, brought into relation according to correct proportions, produce something superior and beautiful. Not merely a musical concept, a cosmological principle. Knowledge of the numerical ratios governing the universe, accessible through geometry, mathematics, music, physics, medicine, astronomy, was for the Pythagoreans the royal road to wisdom. And music occupied a privileged position in this program because it made those proportions audible. It rendered physically perceptible what could otherwise only be thought. There is a symbol the Pythagoreans treated with something close to reverence, the tetractys, from the Greek meaning the four. It was the progression of the first four integers, 1, 2, 3, 4. Which sounds trivial. It is not. These four numbers sum to 10, the decade, the number of perfection. But more importantly, their pairwise ratios, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, are precisely the ratios of the octave, the fifth, and the fourth, the foundational building blocks of the entire Western musical scale. The solar system itself, in Pythagorean cosmology, was governed by the tetractys. The planets were a cosmic seven-stringed lyre played by Apollo, each producing its own note, together generating what the Pythagoreans called the music of the spheres, the music of the cosmos. We do not hear this music, not because it does not exist, but because we are so immersed in it from birth that our senses no longer register it. Like someone who lives next to a waterfall and eventually stops hearing it. The music of the spheres is not a poetic metaphor. It is a scientific theory, or rather, something that predates the separation of science from metaphysics as distinct disciplines. And it has had an extraordinarily long life. Kepler, in 1619, took it seriously enough to devote an entire book to it, Harmonices Mundi, the harmony of the world, in which he described the musical laws governing planetary motion. Mercury sings soprano, he wrote, Mars tenor, Saturn and Jupiter bass, Earth and Venus alto. And in his third law of planetary motion, still taught in physics today, the ratio of a fifth reappears. The square of a planet's orbital period is proportional to the cube of its distance from the Sun. Newton, in the Principia of 1687, did the same. He showed that the law of universal gravitation was, in effect, implicit in the laws of Pythagorean harmony. Pythagorean mathematics at the heart of modern science. This is not mysticism. This is the long, tenacious shadow of a genuinely correct intuition, one that Western philosophy would spend 2 millennia trying, with remarkable consistency, to mislay. There is an aspect of Pythagorean theory that anticipates, by 2,000 years, certain findings of modern cognitive psychology. The Pythagoreans had understood that when we hear a consonant interval, two notes that sound well together, what we are unconsciously registering is the simplicity of the numerical ratio that connects them. The octave sounds consonant because our auditory system recognizes the 2-to-1 ratio. The fifth because it recognizes 3-to-2. This capacity to recognize numerical proportions was, for the Pythagoreans, a higher faculty, distinct from mere sensory perception. They called it the pleasure of proportions, an intellectual pleasure close to mathematical joy, fundamentally different from the raw physical pleasure of agreeable sound. Here, already in embryo, is the problem that will pursue the philosophy of music for centuries. Does music give pleasure because it is beautiful? Or is it beautiful because it is mathematically ordered? And is the pleasure we feel a fact of the senses or a fact of reason? The Pythagoreans had a clear answer. It is a fact of reason. Music is science. Full stop. So far, so elegant. But there is a problem. A small, treacherous, mathematically inevitable problem. If you build a musical scale by stacking successive perfect fifths, that is, ratios of 3-to-2, you should, in principle, arrive back at your starting point after 12 steps, several octaves higher. In principle. In practice, you never quite get there. There is a gap, tiny but real and stubborn, between the cycle of fifths and the cycle of octaves. This gap is called the Pythagorean comma, imperceptible in a single interval, but devastating when you try to build a keyboard instrument that plays in tune in all keys without retuning. In other words, Pythagorean mathematics is almost perfect. Almost. That almost tormented music theorists for 2,000 years. The solution, dividing the octave into 12 equal semitones, each carrying a slightly irrational value, was only fully worked out in the 18th century. Bach celebrated it by writing the Well-Tempered Clavier. But it took 20 centuries and a compromise that would have appalled Pythagoras to get there. We arrive now at the pivotal moment, the moment when something begins sliding in the wrong direction. Plato knows Pythagorean thought, he admires it, he uses it extensively, without ever naming Pythagoras directly, in what seems almost a tick of intellectual propriety. The Timaeus is practically a compendium of Pythagorean cosmology rewritten in Platonic terms. But Plato introduces something the Pythagoreans did not have, or did not have so explicitly, a moral hierarchy of music. For Plato, the Greek word musike, which encompassed everything inspired by the muses, dance, poetry, music, drama, was fundamentally different from techne, practical craft skill. This distinction seems unremarkable. It is not. It is the first embryo of the idea that music is an art rather than a science. In the Republic, Plato divides music into two types, that which elevates the soul, the Dorian and Lydian modes, and that which corrupts it. The flute is banned from the ideal city. Music that stimulates intoxication and uncontrolled movement is viewed with deep suspicion. Plato is the first great censor of music in Western history. He will not be the last. And the reason Plato censors is not aesthetic. He is not saying, "This sounds ugly." The reason is moral and political, that music corrupts character. It acts on the soul in dangerous ways. It must therefore be regulated by the state. Here, the misunderstanding is born. Not yet fully formed, Plato still retains a partly Pythagorean perspective, and in the Timaeus, music remains a cosmic science. But the emphasis shifts. The central question is no longer, what are the mathematical laws of music, but what effect does music have on the human soul? From number to emotion, from science to ethics. And with Plato, there consolidates another distinction that will poison the relationship between philosophers and musicians for centuries. The split between those who think music and those who make it. The philosopher contemplates intelligible harmony. The working musician produces sounds. These are different activities, and the second is worth less than the first. An abyssal fracture, and one that, in various disguises, persists to the present day. With Aristotle, the aim is adjusted, but in a direction that, paradoxically, moves music even further from science. Aristotle is an empiricist, and he has a gift for calling things what they are. Music gives pleasure. This is a fact. And pleasure is not necessarily something to be ashamed of, provided it is the pleasure of the free man, not the artisan performing for money. So Aristotle rehabilitates listening to music as a noble and legitimate occupation, but condemns professional performance as a servile art, fit only for tradesmen. A gentleman may listen to music, and may even learn it as a young man, the better to judge it intelligently. But to become a professional musician is undignified, and here, for the first time explicitly, appears the pair listening/performing, another version of our perennial Orphic/Dionysian dualism. On one side, the audience that listens and judges. On the other, the musician who plays and does not think. On one side, Orpheus, on the other, Dionysus. The same fault line, now encoded in social class. Aristotle also takes the trouble to state that he does not believe in the music of the spheres. There is no music in the heavenly spheres, he says, not actually, not potentially. It is a pleasing metaphor, but not a physical reality. His critical distance from the Pythagoreans is explicit and firm. But, and this is the point, in abandoning the cosmological dimension of music, Aristotle replaces it with something else, the psychological and hedonic dimension. Music matters because it imitates human passions and acts on the soul. The famous catharsis, the emotional purification that music produces in the listener. Again, from number to emotion. Music ceases to be an object of natural philosophy and becomes an object of ethics and psychology. The misunderstanding deepens. And meanwhile, the Pythagorean inheritance, music as the science of proportions, is absorbed by Boethius in the 6th century AD, who divides music into 3 types: the music of the cosmos, the music of the human body, and the music of instruments. Only the last is audible. The first 2 are mathematical structures sustaining the universe. A remarkable vision, which the Middle Ages will repeat like a mantra for 1,000 years, slowly draining it of meaning. Let us pause on what we have seen. The Pythagoreans had understood that music is a physical mathematical phenomenon, that its intervals obey precise numerical laws, that those laws are the same ones governing the cosmos, that listening to music, in its deepest sense, is an act of scientific knowledge, not aesthetic contemplation. This intuition was correct. It was proto-scientific in the truest sense. It anticipates acoustics, psychoacoustics, frequency theory, signal mathematics. Had Pythagoras lived today, he would have found his proportions in Fourier transforms, in spectral analysis of sound, in audio synthesis algorithms. And yet this intuition will be progressively marginalized. First, Plato will load it with moral significance. Then Aristotle will convert it into a psychology of the emotions. Then the Middle Ages will freeze it into empty formula. Then Romanticism will forget it entirely. And 20th century analytic philosophy, instead of returning to scientific origins, will lose itself in the question, what exactly is a musical work? A question the Pythagoreans would not even have understood. But that is already the story of the next chapter. Chapter 2: 1,000 Years of Frozen Music. At the end of the ancient world, 2 men saved the philosophy of music from the wreckage of the Roman Empire. Their names are Augustine of Hippo and Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius. Without them, a substantial part of Greek musical thought would have been lost entirely. The Middle Ages would have had to start from scratch. Augustine, who lived from 354 to 430, is a Christian philosopher thoroughly at home in the Platonic tradition and thoroughly intent on bending it to the service of the new theology. For him, music has a double face. It is a powerful instrument of spiritual elevation when it serves the word of God, and a dangerous enchantment when it seduces the senses for pure pleasure. A tension he never fully resolves and confesses with rare honesty in the Confessions. Boethius, a few decades later, does something different. He translates and systematizes Greek musical knowledge with such precision and authority that the Middle Ages will follow him as a Bible for nearly 1,000 years. Boethius's most influential contribution is the tripartition of music in the De Institutione Musica. 3 types of music, 3 levels of reality. Musica mundana, the music of the cosmos, the harmony of the planets and celestial spheres. Musica humana, the music of the human body, the proportions between soul and body, between reason and sensation. Musica instrumentalis, the music produced by instruments, the music we actually hear. Only the last is perceptible to the ear. The first two are invisible mathematical structures sustaining the universe and the human being. To listen to music, in the deepest sense, means to attune oneself to those superior proportions through the third, audible kind. It is an extraordinarily rich and coherent vision, and it is still, at its core, Pythagorean. Music as the manifestation of cosmic numerical laws. Boethius has no doubt. The one who truly understands music is not the musician who plays, but the theorist who knows its mathematical proportions. This Boethian distinction between those who think music and those who play it crystallizes in the Middle Ages into a pair of technical terms worth knowing, because they reveal an entire mentality. On one side, the musici, the theorists, those who know the mathematical laws of music, who understand why certain sounds work together. On the other, the cantores, the singers, the performers, those who play and sing without necessarily grasping the reasons for what they do. Guido of Arezzo, the 11th century monk who invented the system of musical notation that is still the basis of modern notation, is unambiguous on the matter. He writes, "Between the musici and the cantores, the distance is great. The latter say, the former know what music comprises. He who does what he does not know is defined as a beast." A beast. Not exactly a generous assessment of practical musicians. The Pythagorean misunderstanding deepens, music as science remains, but it becomes the exclusive privilege of the theorist. The musician who plays is relegated to an inferior rank. Meanwhile, in the concrete practice of churches and monasteries, music leads a life of its own, parallel to and almost independent of the theoretical speculations of philosophers. Gregorian chant, the corpus of sacred melodies named for Pope Gregory I, who promoted its standardization in the 6th century, becomes the dominant musical form of Christian Western Europe for centuries. And its founding principle is perfectly Platonic. The word governs the sound. Melody serves the liturgical text. Rhythm follows the prosody of the Latin syllables. There is no fixed meter, no regular beat. There is the flowing, sung declamation of the Word of God. It is austere, monophonic music, a single voice or a choir in unison without superimposed harmonies, and deliberately stripped of anything that might distract attention from the sacred text. Dionysus, for now, is kept firmly outside the door. Here something interesting happens, and for our story, decisive. Theorists from the 8th to the 11th century repeat without pause the definitions of Boethius, Augustine, Isidore of Seville, and Cassiodorus. They copy them, paraphrase them, cite them. The musical treatises of this period are often an endless chain of references to previous authorities. The problem is that those definitions, the Boethian tripartition, music as a discipline of the quadrivium alongside mathematics, geometry, and astronomy, had a precise meaning in the context in which they were formulated. Repeated mechanically for centuries, they slowly hollow out. They become liturgical formulas of knowledge. One says that musica mundana is the harmony of the planets, but no one asks anymore what this actually means or how it connects to the music sung in church. It is like reciting a prayer in a language one no longer understands. All the words are there, the meaning has departed. Musical thought freezes solid. Then, around the 9th and 10th centuries, something musically revolutionary occurs, and philosophically disruptive. Someone begins adding a second voice to the Gregorian chant. The organum is born, the first systematic form of polyphony in Western music. Two voices singing together at the interval of a fifth or a fourth. In its earliest forms, it was parallel and almost mechanical. But it was already something radically new. For the first time, sound was no longer a single thread, but a texture, a weave. This concrete musical fact begins putting pressure on all the theoretical speculation that preceded it. If music is essentially word, as Plato and the Church Fathers had taught, how does one justify this layering of voices that makes the text less comprehensible? If music is the mathematical harmony of the spheres, as Boethius had taught, in what way does this new sonic complexity relate to the cosmic proportions? The questions remain open, but the ice begins to crack. By the 14th century, the situation explodes. Polyphonic music has developed in extraordinary ways, in motets, masses, the secular music of the troubadours and trouvères, and its rhythmic and harmonic complexity has nothing left in common with the sober Gregorian monophony. In 1322, Pope John XXII issues a famous papal bull condemning modernist tendencies in music. Rhythms too complicated, melodies too elaborate, an excess of ornamentation rendering liturgical texts incomprehensible. The new music is labeled ars nova, new art, in polemical contrast with the ars antiqua, the more restrained tradition. The Church officially aligns itself against musical innovation. It is a confrontation we recognize immediately. On one side, those who want music to serve the sacred text and remain clear, sober, subordinate to the word. On the other, those who want music to develop according to its own internal laws, its own contrapuntal logic, its own complexity. Orpheus against Dionysus, once again. The misunderstanding assumes a new form. With humanism, from the 13th and 14th centuries onward, something important shifts in the relationship between those who think music and those who make it. The humanist ideal of the complete man, one who knows everything, does everything, embodies everything, a microcosm that recapitulates the macrocosm, begins to heal that millennial fracture between theorists and musicians. Marsilio Ficino, Neoplatonic philosopher of Medicean Florence, inaugurates a long tradition of philosopher-musicians. He plays the lute while reciting the Orphic hymns. This is not a contradiction. It is the realization of the humanist ideal. Knowledge and practice are no longer enemies. And in the Florence of the second half of the 16th century, the Camerata Bardi is born, a group of intellectuals, poets, and musicians, including Vincenzo Galilei, father of the more famous Galileo, who elaborate a revolutionary idea. Medieval polyphony is Gothic barbarism. One must return to the simplicity of ancient Greek music, to monody, to melody that moves the affections. From this reflection, opera is born. Around 1600, what the Camerata Bardi produces is not merely a new musical genre, it is a new philosophy of music in practical form. The principle is that of recitar cantando, setting text to music such that it remains always intelligible, the melody following the words and heightening their emotional meaning. A monody accompanied by simple chords, where the text counts for more than any musical virtuosity. Monteverdi brings this principle to its highest and most complex expression. But conflict immediately emerges. Giovanni Maria Artusi, conservative theorist, attacks Monteverdi for using dissonances that offend the ear and violate the laws of reason. Monteverdi responds with a distinction between prima pratica, the rigorous polyphony of the contrapuntists, and seconda pratica, the new expressive music that places feeling before rules. Two practices, two philosophies. Music as rational order against music as emotional expression. The balance tips decisively toward Dionysus. In the 16th century, Luther's Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation produce a division in European musical thought that is as geographical as it is philosophical. In the Catholic world, Italy and France above all, the Church uses music primarily as a vehicle for the sacred message. The clarity of the liturgical text is paramount. Elaborate polyphony is viewed with suspicion. Music must serve the word. In the Protestant world, Germany and the Nordic countries, music acquires an autonomous dignity. Luther was himself a musician and loved music deeply. For him, music is a gift of God that elevates the soul as music, independently of the text. It is a scientific study with mathematical, physical, and acoustic foundations. A genuine heir in this of the most authentic Pythagoreanism. Two Europes, two philosophies of music. The fracture will last for centuries and have profound consequences for all subsequent musical thought. Across this long arc, from the 5th to the 16th century, music led a double life. On one side, theoretical speculation, faithful to the Pythagorean Platonic tradition, preserved and transmitted by Boethius, repeated mechanically by medieval theorists, which formally maintained music within the quadrivium as a branch of science. On the other, concrete musical practice, Gregorian chant, organum, polyphony, ars nova, opera, which developed according to its own logic, responding to ever-new liturgical, aesthetic, and expressive demands. These two streams almost never genuinely met. Theory said one thing, practice did another. And the result is that the scientific concept of music, the most precious legacy of the Pythagoreans, progressively emptied out, becoming hollow formula. While concrete music, the music that is played and heard, went its own way without an adequate philosophy to understand it. The ground is prepared for the next step, the decisive one, the one that will definitively transform music from an object of philosophy of science into an object of aesthetics. But that is the next chapter. Chapter 3. The Problem of Expression. There is a precise moment when the misunderstanding becomes official. Not a dramatic event, not a revolution, an intellectual convention. In the 18th century, during the Enlightenment, it is established by consensus that music is primarily an art, like painting, like architecture, like sculpture. This seems obvious. It was not obvious at all. For 2,000 years, music had been also, and above all, a science. A discipline of the quadrivium, alongside mathematics, geometry, and astronomy. A pathway to the numerical laws of the universe. From this moment onward, all of that disappears. Music enters the orbit of aesthetics, the philosophy of beauty and art, and stays there. From this point, the history of the philosophy of music can be made to coincide, almost entirely, with the history of musical aesthetics. A spectacular reduction, an impoverishment dressed up as progress. Romanticism, sweeping across Europe between the late 18th and the first half of the 19th century, transforms this Enlightenment convention into something close to an exaltation. For the Romantics, music is not merely one art among others. It is the queen of the arts, the art par excellence. Wackenroder, a German writer of the late 18th century, is among the first to formulate this idea with force. Music expresses the original language of feeling, the one through which the soul can make direct contact with the divine. Not through reason, not through mathematics, through sentiment. It is a Copernican revolution with respect to the Pythagoreans. Number yields to emotion. Proportion yields to the sublime. For Novalis, music is the limit toward which poetry strives for total liberation. For Goethe, a temple through which one enters the divine. For Schelling, the revelation of the absolute, the form of eternity. All in agreement, music is the language of the inexpressible. Hegel inserts music into his grand philosophical system with a precision worth appreciating. His philosophy of art, the aesthetics, arranges the arts in a hierarchy running from architecture, the most material and spatial, up to poetry, the most spiritual. Music sits near the top of this scale. For Hegel, music is a temporal art, and this temporality is not that of natural phenomena, but of the interior subject. Sound penetrates the self, seizes it in its simple existence, sets it in motion, and draws it along in its cadenced rhythm. Music is the revelation of the absolute in the form of feeling. Notice what has happened. What for the Pythagoreans was the revelation of the absolute in the form of number, for Hegel is the revelation of the absolute in the form of feeling. The structure of the intuition is identical. Music as a window onto something larger, but the content of that window has changed completely. From number to feeling, from cosmos to self, from science to subjectivity. But it is Arthur Schopenhauer, pessimist philosopher, admirer of Plato and Buddhism, contemporary of Hegel, whom he regarded with ostentatious contempt, who produces the most powerful and most influential philosophical systematization of romantic music. In his masterwork, The World as Will and Representation of 1818, Schopenhauer constructs a system in which all of reality is will, a blind, irrational, inexhaustible force that manifests in the world as representation. The arts are objectifications of this will at various levels, but music occupies an entirely special position. The other arts, sculpture, painting, poetry, are images of the ideas through which the will objectifies itself. Music, by contrast, is not an image of the ideas. It is an image of the will itself, direct, without mediation. Schopenhauer writes, "The effect of music is so much more powerful and penetrating than that of the other arts because they give us the reflection, while music gives us the essence." Music, in short, is the only art that speaks the language of ultimate reality directly. It does not describe it. It is it. There is an extraordinary paradox in Schopenhauer's thinking about music that is worth dwelling on, because it shows how genuinely irresolvable the problem had become within the Romantic frame. On one hand, Schopenhauer exalts music as the most universal and profound language in existence, more universal than concepts, more profound than philosophy itself. On the other, precisely because of this untranslatable universality, he insists that music cannot be spoken of except through metaphor. Ordinary language has no tools to capture its essence. Any verbal description of music is inevitably inadequate. This is the exact opposite of what the Pythagoreans thought. For them, music was perfectly describable in numbers. The ratios 2:1, 3:2, 4:3 were precise and complete descriptions of musical intervals. For Schopenhauer, that kind of precision is impossible because music is ineffable, literally unsayable. The romantic misunderstanding has reached its apex. Richard Wagner is the musician who puts Schopenhauer's ideas on stage, literally. Composer, poet, philosopher, and tireless polemicist, Wagner elaborates in his numerous theoretical writings a vision of music that is simultaneously the most ambitious and the most explicitly Dionysian in Western history. His project is the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. An art that unifies music, poetry, dance, and stagecraft into a single expressive organism. Wagner was convinced that traditional opera had made a fundamental error. It had made music, which should be the means, into the end, and drama, which should be the end, into a mere pretext. The hierarchy needed to be inverted. The Wagnerian music drama, The Ring, Tristan and Isolde, Parsifal, is music that never stops, that flows uninterruptedly like a river of emotion, that dissolves the boundary between individual musical numbers into a total expressive continuum. Dionysus has won. Music is feeling, intoxication, cosmic identification with the will of the world. Here enters the philosopher who, with a single book, permanently changed the way we think about music and about art in general. Friedrich Nietzsche, in 1872, publishes The Birth of Tragedy. He is 28 years old, still a friend of Wagner, and he constructs an interpretive framework that has become one of the most cited and most misread in the history of philosophy. The thesis is simple and electrifying. Every great art is born from the equilibrium between two fundamental and opposing impulses. The Apolline, serene, contemplative, formal, ordered, luminous as the god of the sun. And the Dionysian, passionate, chaotic, orgiastic, collective, intoxicated as the god of wine. Now, this book has proposed, and will continue to propose, a correction to Nietzsche's terminology. Not Apollo, but Orpheus. Apollo is a god of perfect metaphysical distance. Orpheus is a musician who knows the laws of number and descends into the underworld to test them against grief. The opposition Orpheus-Dionysus is not a variation on Nietzsche's theme. It is a philosophically distinct claim about what is actually at stake in musical thought. The rational pole of this tension is not divine serenity. It is embodied, mortal, and it can lose. This is the point where we need to pause and be precise, because what Nietzsche gives us is powerful, but for the philosophy of music specifically, it is not quite right. Apollo does not play. He is the god of celestial harmony, of visible proportion, of sculpture and poetry, a perfect metaphor for the arts of space. But music exists in time, is produced with the body, obeys mathematical laws, and simultaneously moves us. Apollo remains too distant from concrete sonic experience to serve as the right pole of this opposition. That is why, in this book, Apollo is replaced by Orpheus. Not an arbitrary substitution, a philosophical clarification. Orpheus is the musician of Greek myth. He plays the lyre, sings, reasons. He knows the mathematical laws of sound and inhabits them from within, translating them into melody. He carries inside himself what Apollo had only contemplated from the outside. This move, Orpheus in place of Apollo within the Nietzschean pair, is not against Nietzsche. It is with Nietzsche, and one step further, in the specific direction of the philosophy of music. Orpheus against Dionysus. This is the pair that will accompany us to the end. There is a sociological phenomenon of romanticism that is revealing of music's new position in culture. For the first time in history, everyone writes about music. Not only theorists and philosophers, but poets, novelists, painters, amateur critics. Never before has such a quantity of writing about music circulated so widely. The problem is that this democratization of musical discourse brings with it an inevitable dilettantism. Romantic criticism often grounds its judgments in subjective impression, with a markedly literary tone far from technical analysis. A naive enthusiasm prevails for this marvelous art, capable of opening doors to an unknown realm. No numbers, no proportions, no acoustics. Only evocations, metaphors, images of dream. The discourse on music has grown richer in quantity and poorer in rigor. Dionysus reigns supreme, but Orpheus is preparing a counteroffensive. In 1854, at the very time Wagner is composing Tristan and Isolde, the Viennese music critic Eduard Hanslick publishes an essay that reads as a declaration of war on Romanticism. On the musically beautiful. Hanslick's thesis is radical and deliberately provocative. Music does not express feelings. It cannot and should not. Music has no emotional content, it has musical content. The forms that sounds produce are not empty, they are full of significance, but a musical significance, not translatable into words or emotions. He writes, "In music there is sense and logic, but musical sense and musical logic." Hanslick speaks of arabesque, an arabesque full of meaning and ideas, needing nothing external to be understood. Music is form that defines itself. It does not describe sadness. It is, or is not, musically achieved. The aesthetic judgment on music must be a judgment about musical structure, not about the emotions it arouses. With Hanslick, one of the most tenacious and passionate controversies in the philosophy of music officially opens. The war between the aesthetics of form and the aesthetics of content. A war that will last more than a century and run through all of 20th century philosophy and musicology. On one side, the expressionists or contentionists, those who believe music can and should express emotions, feelings, moods, even ideas. Wagner is their practical champion, Schopenhauer their theoretical one. On the other, the formalists or absolutists, those who believe music is pure autonomous structure, referring to nothing outside itself. Hanslick is their theorist, Brahms, Wagner's artistic nemesis, their practical champion. Orpheus against Dionysus, once again. In 19th century dress, hair neatly combed, wearing a frock coat, the same match, played with more refined conceptual tools. And the same result, no one wins outright, and everyone loses sight of Pythagoras. In the second half of the 19th century, the intellectual climate shifts. Romanticism wanes, and with it, that enthusiastic, slightly rhetorical literary tone of discourse about music. Positivism arrives, faith in science, in method, in measurement. And paradoxically, this moves the study of music closer to science, at least in intention. Two autonomous disciplines emerge that will prove enormously important in the 20th century. The first is the psychology of music, founded in Germany by Hermann von Helmholtz, who studies music at the psychoacoustic level, frequencies, resonances, perception. A direct descendant, in certain respects, of Pythagoreanism. Music as a measurable physical fact. The second is musicology, the German Musikwissenschaft, which studies music historically and stylistically with analytical rigor. Hanslick is the reference point. His anti-literary, precise, technical attitude becomes the model for all subsequent musical scholarship. Let us take stock. By the end of the 19th century, after a century of romantic aesthetics and positivist reaction, the philosophical landscape of music looks like this. Music is now firmly and uncontestedly an art. The scientific status the Pythagoreans had assigned it, and which Boethius had formerly kept alive for a millennium, is definitively abandoned as a serious philosophical position. Not because it has been refuted, simply because no one defends it any longer. The debate unfolds entirely within aesthetics. Does music express emotions or not? Is it pure form, or does it have content? Should it be autonomous or integrated with the other arts? These are legitimate and interesting questions, but they all already assume as given precisely what the Pythagoreans would have challenged, that music is, first and foremost, a subjective, emotional, aesthetic experience. The misunderstanding is complete, and the 20th century, with 12-tone music, with atonality, with musique concrète, with serialism, will only deepen it in increasingly radical ways. But that is the next chapter. Chapter 4. The Birth of the Listener. There is a moment in the history of Western music when everything that had been built across 2,000 years of theory, the scales, the keys, the harmonic hierarchies, the logic of sound that departs and returns home, collapses. Not gradually, all at once. Or so it appears from the outside. We are at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. The tonal language, that system of relationships between sounds which had run from Gregorian chant all the way to Brahms, passing through Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, fractures, splinters, and finally dissolves. Western music passes through one of the most radical transitions in its history, comparable in scope to the discovery of polyphony in the Middle Ages or to the shift toward monody in the 17th century. To understand what happens and why it matters to our story, we need to follow three phases, three moments of a conceptual earthquake that changes not only music, but also the way philosophy thinks about it. The first phase is what we might call germinal, from roughly 1870 to 1900. The ferments are all present, but the tonal structure still holds, if barely. Wagner is the principal agent of infection. His extreme chromaticism, that continuous oscillation between different keys, which in Tristan and Isolde reaches a point of near irresolvability, has already destabilized the tonal system from within. Every chord tends toward the next without ever quite arriving home. The tension is permanent, resolution perpetually deferred. Alongside Wagner, Debussy develops a harmonic impressionism that dissolves tonal contours into a haze of sonic color. Reger pushes Wagnerian chromaticism to the threshold of saturation. And meanwhile, quietly, the first historical studies of ancient and oriental music begin demonstrating something fundamental. The tonal system is not a law of nature. It is a historical convention. It is neither unique nor eternal. The culminating phase, from around 1900 to 1930, is the one in which the definitive break occurs. Its principal protagonist is Arnold Schoenberg, a Viennese composer who begins in a densely late Romantic idiom and arrives, through a period of free atonality, at the formulation of the 12-tone technique. What is 12-tone music? It is a compositional method starting from a radically egalitarian premise. All 12 notes of the chromatic scale have equal importance. None is more central than any other. None is the tonic toward which everything gravitates. A series is constructed, an ordered sequence of all 12 pitches, and from that series, through its transformations, inversion, retrograde, retrograde inversion, all compositional material is derived. The sonic result is something that audiences of the period, and often of today, find austere, cold, lacking the emotional logic that tonal music had trained ears to expect for centuries. And this is precisely the objective, to zero out expectations, to begin again from zero. At this point, it is worth pausing on a question that bears directly on our story. Is 12-tone music a Dionysian gesture or an Orphic one? Chaotic or ordered? Emotional or mathematical? The answer is paradoxical. 12-tone composition is the most rigidly mathematical compositional system Western music has ever produced. There is no improvisation, no immediate expressive freedom. There is a serial procedure of extraordinary combinatorial precision. The possible arrangements of a 12-note series number nearly 500 million. Schoenberg does not liberate music from laws. He subjects it to new laws, more abstract and more rigorous than the tonal ones. And yet, audiences experience it as pure Dionysus, chaos, disorder, incomprehensibility. This misunderstanding is extraordinarily instructive. It demonstrates that the perception of musical order is not absolute, but depends on cultural habituation. Change the convention, and you change the ear. Pythagoras would have had a great deal to say about this. Orpheus, one suspects, would have understood immediately. The third phase, from the 1930s through the 1960s, is the one in which the ideas fermented in the preceding period are pushed to their extreme consequences. It is the post-Weberian phase, named for Anton Webern, Schoenberg's student, who carries serial technique to a purity that is almost antiseptic. Extremely brief compositions, meditated silences, sounds isolated like points in space. On these foundations, the radical post-war avant-gardes flourish. Pierre Schaeffer's Musique concrète, which uses recorded and manipulated sounds as compositional material, the pointillist music of Boulez and Stockhausen, the aleatory music of John Cage, in which chance, rather than the composer, determines the order of sounds, spatial music, which distributes musicians around the listening space, and above all, the electronic medium. For the first time in history, sound can be generated without traditional instruments, without human performers, without even the physical laws governing the vibration of strings or air columns. A revolution comparable in scope to the invention of the printing press for literature. Into this philosophically convulsed landscape emerges the intellectually most powerful and most controversial figure in 20th century musical thought, Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno. Philosopher, sociologist, musician, a student of Alban Berg, who was himself a student of Schoenberg. Adorno is the great interpreter of the 20th century musical crisis. His foundational work on music, Philosophy of Modern Music, from 1949, begins from a grandiose premise. The new music, Schoenberg's 12-tone music, is not incomprehensible for technical reasons. It is incomprehensible because it is the only art that tells the truth about the contemporary world. A world fractured and alienated, in which bourgeois values dissolved in the trenches of the First World War and in the furnaces of the extermination camps. Schoenberg's music is not beautiful in the traditional sense, but it is authentic. Adorno writes, "It has taken upon itself all the darkness and guilt of the world. No one wants anything to do with it. It resounds unheard, without echo. It is truly the message in a bottle." Adorno constructs his argument around a sharp and deliberately provocative dichotomy between two giants of 20th century music, Schoenberg and Stravinsky. Schoenberg represents the path of authenticity. His music confronts the present without masks, expresses the subjective anguish of the individual in the modern world, refuses any compromise with public taste. It is an art that resists the capitalist standardization of culture. Stravinsky, with his neoclassicism, his ironic recovery of past styles, his accessible and brilliant music, represents for Adorno the path of inauthenticity, an artificial recovery of the past that places music outside history, that accepts the task of representing the petrification of human relations within the traditional tonal system. In short, Stravinsky does what the market wants. Schoenberg does what history demands. It is a sharp and contentious judgment, and many have contested it vigorously. But its argumentative force dominated the musical debate for decades, and it still frames discussions that pretend to have moved beyond it. There is a second dimension of Adorno's thought that deserves attention, because it anticipates many of the discussions that still fill newspaper pages and social media feeds about music today. Adorno argues that capitalism and the rise of the bourgeoisie have produced an irreparable fracture between serious art and mass entertainment. The former, complex, autonomous, critical, is reserved for those with the cultural tools to comprehend it. The latter, simple, standardized, repetitive, is produced as ideological nourishment for the masses, what Adorno calls the culture industry. Popular music, radio, commercial jazz. For Adorno, these are mechanisms of social control disguised as entertainment. They do not liberate the listener. They condition him, habituate him to repetitive patterns, render him passive. True music, the kind that disturbs, that cannot be listened to distractedly, is the only kind that can keep critical consciousness alive. An argument that divides still today, and one that would make no sense without the entire history that precedes it. While Adorno interprets the musical crisis through the filter of Marxist dialectics and Freudian psychology, another philosophical current attempts a radically different approach: phenomenology. Phenomenology, founded by Edmund Husserl at the start of the 20th century, proposes studying phenomena as they present themselves to consciousness, bracketing all theoretical presuppositions. Applied to music, this means Listen to the sound for what it is, without bringing along tonal expectations, historical conventions, pre-formed aesthetic judgments. René Leibovitz applies this perspective to 12-tone music and finds a perfect correspondence. Schoenberg, in discarding the tonal system, has done exactly this. He has bracketed the entire pre-established musical world and begun again from the pure experience of sound. A Husserlian gesture in music. His opponent, Ernest Ansermet, uses the same phenomenological perspective to defend tonality. Tonal law is the ethical law of musical consciousness. To lose it is equivalent to the death of God. Same philosophy, opposite conclusions, which should give us pause. A third intellectual tendency makes its way through 20th century musical thought: structuralism. Born in linguistics with Ferdinand de Saussure, structuralism studies cultural phenomena as systems of signs and relations, independently of their content or history. Applied to music, structuralism poses precise questions. Does music have a grammar? Are there deep structures underlying the sonic surface, as grammar underlies language? Is it possible to analyze a musical work with the same precision one brings to the analysis of a sentence? The most sophisticated and influential answer arrives decades later with the generative theory of tonal music by Lerdahl and Jackendorf, an attempt to apply to music the tools of Chomsky's generative grammar. A fascinating path that leads, once again, toward that structural and quasi-mathematical dimension that the Pythagoreans had indicated 2,000 years earlier. The circle tightens. Orpheus, one begins to suspect, was not entirely wrong. Let us look at the musical 20th century from above and ask honestly, what did it resolve? Almost nothing. It radicalized the problems, pushed them to the limit, translated them into music and philosophy with unprecedented intensity. But the central knot, what music is, what it does, why it has the power it has, remained untied. 12-tone composition demonstrated that the tonal system was a convention, not a law of nature. Phenomenology demonstrated that musical experience is more complex than any theory. Structuralism began building the tools to analyze it with rigor. Adorno demonstrated that music is always immersed in a social and historical context from which it cannot be separated. But no one picked up the Pythagorean thread. No one said, music is a physical, mathematical phenomenon, and its philosophical status should begin from there. That thread remained abandoned, considered superseded, archaic, pre-philosophical. Analytic philosophy takes it up next. But even analytic philosophy, as we will see, chooses a different road. And that road leads to a question Pythagoras would not have understood. Chapter 5. What is a musical work? There is a question that the Anglophone philosophy of music in the second half of the 20th century pursued with extraordinary tenacity, admirable technical rigor, and instruments of conceptual precision that genuinely deserve respect. A question around which dozens of books, hundreds of articles, and entire international conferences have been organized. The question is this: what is a musical work? It appears to be the right question. In fact, and this is the thesis we have been building chapter by chapter, it is the wrong question. Or more precisely, it is a question that already presupposes an answer, the answer that the millennial misunderstanding has imposed as obvious. It presupposes that music consists of works, definable, classifiable artistic objects with precise identity conditions. It presupposes that the task of philosophy of music is to understand how these objects exist. Pythagoras would not have understood the question. For him, music was not a collection of works. It was a system of numerical ratios. The pertinent question would have been, what are the proportions governing these sounds? Not, what is the ontological status of this symphony? Analytic philosophy is born in Britain at the start of the 20th century, with Russell, Moore, and the early Wittgenstein. Its method is the logical analysis of language, clarifying the meaning of concepts through terminological precision, internal coherence, and the verifiability of claims. Applied to aesthetics, this method produces something new and genuinely fascinating. For the first time, an attempt is made to answer questions about art, not with grand speculative systems, as Hegel or Schopenhauer had done, but with precise arguments, verifiable formulations, sharply drawn conceptual distinctions. Less poetry, more logic. Between the 1940s and 1960s, analytic philosophy becomes dominant in the Anglophone world, pushing to the margins the phenomenological, existentialist, and Marxist traditions that dominated on the European continent. A new discipline emerges, analytic aesthetics, and within it, analytic philosophy of music, which will occupy itself for decades almost exclusively with a single problem. How do we identify musical works? How do we establish that two different performances are performances of the same work? In 1968, Nelson Goodman publishes Languages of Art, a work of analytic aesthetics that becomes an obligatory reference point for anyone working in philosophy of music. Goodman's starting point is an elegant and powerful distinction between autographic and allographic arts. An art is autographic when the authenticity of a work depends on its productive history. A Rembrandt painting is authentic only if it was physically produced by Rembrandt. A perfect copy, indistinguishable to the eye, is nonetheless a forgery. What matters is provenance, not merely appearance. An art is allographic when the distinction between original and copy makes no sense. Music is an allographic art. One printed copy of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is no more or less authentic than another. What matters is not the productive history of the individual physical object, but conformity to a notational system. It is a distinction of genuine analytical power, and, as Lydia Gurr would later show in the Imaginary Museum of Musical Works, the book that provided a crucial impetus for the thesis underlying this audiobook, it also reveals something important about the historical assumptions quietly buried inside it. From this distinction, Goodman derives his definition of a musical work, which is at once precise, elegant, and, as we will see, deeply problematic. A musical work is a class of performances compliant with a score. Translated into plain English, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is not the score, that is merely the code. It is not any single performance, that is merely one realization. The Fifth Symphony is the set of all correct performances, all performances that faithfully comply with the notational prescriptions of the score. For Goodman, this compliance must be perfect and total. A single wrong note, even one, and technically, one is not performing the Fifth Symphony, but something else. The most brilliant performance in history, if it contains one error, does not count as a performance of the work. The most tedious performance imaginable, if it contains none, does. Goodman is aware that this result is counterintuitive. He prefers logical consistency to practical intuition. This, one might observe, is a very Orphic disposition, and it is about to generate some very Dionysian consequences. The consequences of Goodman's theory are, at this point, entertaining in their logical rigidity, and his critics did not pass up the opportunity to make them vivid. First problem. If during a performance, one of the musicians sneezes, and the sound of the sneeze overlaps with the music, are we still hearing the Fifth Symphony? Goodman is forced to say no. The total sonic event is not compliant with the score. But then every live concert is inevitably a non-performance, since audience coughs, chair scrapings, and ambient noises are always present. Second problem, still more unsparing. If we permit even the smallest deviation from the score, one slightly altered note per performance, then by the logical principle of transitivity, through a chain of small successive deviations, we could pass from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony to Three Blind Mice. Goodman cites this example himself with a certain Olympian serenity that is either admirable or maddening, depending on your temperament. Goodman also addresses the second great problem of the philosophy of music. In what sense does music express emotions? How does expressive language work when applied to music? His answer is technical and original. When we say a piece of music is sad, we are not saying the piece has the property of sadness. Pieces do not feel sadness. We are saying the piece metaphorically exemplifies the predicate sad. That is, the piece possesses, in a metaphorical sense, some of the properties we normally attribute to sadness: slowness, lowering of register, contraction, absence of energy. It is an ingenious answer that transforms an apparently psychological problem, why does music make us feel sad, into a semantic and logical one. How does metaphorical reference work in music? The analytic method delivers. The question becomes more precise, but the answer, many have objected, loses something essential along the way. The sadness one feels listening to Barber's Adagio is not a semantic property. It is an experience. In 1980, Gerald Levinson publishes in the Journal of Philosophy an article destined to become the most discussed contribution to philosophy of music since Goodman. What a musical work is. Levinson starts from a perspective opposite to Goodman's. Where Goodman is a nominalist, holding that only concrete objects exist and that abstractions are linguistic constructions, Levinson is a Platonist. He holds that musical works exist as abstract entities, distinct and independent from their performances and their scores. The Fifth Symphony exists as an abstract object before anyone performs it, before Beethoven even writes it down. But Levinson's Platonism has a special character that distinguishes it from pure Platonism. These abstract structures do not exist eternally, independent of human history. They are created by a specific composer in a specific historical musical context with specific compositional intentions. The Fifth Symphony is an abstract structure, but it is the abstract structure indicated by Beethoven in 1808, with those instruments in that tradition. History is not incidental, it is load-bearing. Levinson formulates three adequacy conditions that any satisfactory account of musical works must meet. They are simple, clear, and, as frequently happens in philosophy, not easy to satisfy all three simultaneously. First condition: musical works must not exist prior to compositional activity. The Fifth Symphony did not exist before Beethoven composed it. This rules out pure Platonism, according to which mathematical structures exist eternally, independent of any human mind. Second condition: musical works must be repeatable. They must be performable multiple times, in different places and at different times, and remain the same work. This rules out theories that identify the work with a single performance. Third condition: performances must be capable of being correct or incorrect with respect to the work. It must make sense to say that a certain performance betrays the work, misinterprets it, executes it wrongly. Goodman satisfies the second and third conditions, but struggles with the first, because for him, the work is defined by the score, and the score is a physical object created at a particular moment. Levinson seeks a more balanced path. At this point, something enters the picture that I know from the inside. Having written, years before this thesis, an article on exactly this problem, when the ideas that became this book were still forming themselves. The problem of musical interpretation is intimately connected to the ontological problem of the work. If the work is the class of all performances compliant with the score, as Goodman holds, then the performer creates nothing. She merely verifies compliance. She is a technician, not an artist. If instead the work is an abstract structure indicated by the composer, but open to historically situated realizations, as Levinson holds, then the performer contributes actively to the life of the work. She is not a mere executor, she is a co-creator. Each performance is not the repetition of something already given, but a new realization of something that never fully exists outside its realizations. Music is a temporal art in the most radical sense. It exists only in time, in the act of becoming. This is not a metaphor. It is what distinguishes music from every other art form, and what makes the ontological question, pursued as a primary question, so systematically misleading. What remains, after decades of debate between nominalists and Platonists, between Goodman and Levinson and their numerous critics and defenders? What remains is a sharp sense of incompleteness. Not because the analytic method is wrong. On the contrary, it has produced conceptual distinctions of genuine precision and utility. But because it chose the wrong question as its starting point. The concept of musical work, around which the entire analytic tradition revolves, is itself a relatively recent historical product. As Lydia Gurr demonstrates in The Imaginary Museum of Musical Works, the 1992 book whose argument was, for me, the decisive catalyst for this entire investigation. Only toward the end of the 18th century did musicians begin thinking about music in terms of works. Discrete objects with precise boundaries, identifiable authors, traceable productive histories. Before that, music was practice, event, liturgy, dance, not a catalogue of artistic objects. Analytic aesthetics took this historically contingent concept and treated it as a universal philosophical category, then wondered why it could not apply it without contradiction. It was the encounter with this text that convinced me, then a philosophy student in Florence, that a thesis on the philosophy of music was a pursuit worth undertaking. For this reason, and for the profound clarity of her thought, Lydia Gurr deserves to be cited with the respect owed to those who fundamentally alter one's perspective on a problem. It was also the beginning of an inquiry that has taken more than 20 years to find its proper form. We have reached almost the end of a long journey. 2,500 years of history, from Pythagoras to late 20th century analytic philosophy, have produced an intellectual landscape of extraordinary richness and deep contradiction. The question with which analytic philosophy obsessed the debate, what is a musical work, is not wrong in any absolute sense. It is wrong as a foundational question, as the starting point for a philosophy of music that genuinely wants to understand the musical phenomenon in its totality. Because that question already presupposes the misunderstanding. It presupposes that music is primarily a collection of artistic objects to be classified and identified, whereas music is, first and most deeply, a physical mathematical phenomenon, a structure of relationships between frequencies, a system of proportions that the human ear perceives and the human brain processes according to principles that modern psychoacoustics has begun to map with increasing precision. The right question is not, what is a musical work? The right question is the one the Pythagoreans had already posed. What are the laws governing sound? And why is the human being so constituted as to perceive those laws as beauty? Chapter 6. Music in the Mind. There is a parallel story running alongside everything we have told so far. A less noisy story, lacking grand aesthetic manifestos, free of polemics between Wagnerians and Brahmsians, without ontological declarations about Platonism or nominalism. A quiet story that unfolds in laboratories, not lecture halls. It is the story of the psychology of music, the discipline that, from the second half of the 19th century onward, takes seriously a question philosophers had continued to sidestep. What happens, concretely, in the body and mind of a human being when listening to music? This is not an aesthetic question. It is not an ontological question. It is a scientific question. And it is, on reflection, the same question the Pythagoreans had posed 2,000 years earlier, formulated now with the tools of modern experimental science rather than those of speculative mathematics. Pythagoras, one suspects, would have recognized these researchers as close relatives, people who measure, people who look for laws. The founding figures of this tradition are two German physicist-physiologists of the 19th century, Gustav Fechner and Hermann von Helmholtz. Both start from the Pythagorean intuition. Music is, first of all, a physical phenomenon, and understanding it requires the tools of the physical sciences, and translate it into a concrete experimental program. Fechner founds psychophysics, the branch of experimental psychology that establishes relations between the physical description of stimuli and observable perceptual behavior. Given a sound with certain measurable physical characteristics, frequency, amplitude, timbre, how does the human ear perceive it? What is the minimum perceptible threshold? How does perception vary with changes in intensity? Helmholtz goes still deeper. He studies the physical structure of the inner ear, develops a resonance model of pitch perception, analyzes the sensory preconditions of consonance and dissonance, and investigates the role of unconscious processes in the perception of melodic sequences. His masterwork, On the Sensations of Tone, 1863, remains an indispensable reference point today. Between the late 19th century and the mid-20th, the psychology of music moves through a series of theoretical schools that mirror the major currents of general psychology. The sensationists conceive the mind as an instrument for detecting and processing sensory impressions. The ear registers sound, the mind organizes it. Music is, at its base, a structured set of physical sensations. The mentalists, Wundt and Titchener, sharply distinguish body from mind, but analyze conscious experience into atoms of sensation. Musical understanding resides in the mind, not the ear. Gestalt psychology, the German response to Wundt, argues that perception of musical form is due to innate reactions of the nervous system. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. A melody is not a succession of notes, but an irreducible perceptual unity. A remarkably modern intuition. Then, from the 1970s onward, cognitivism arrives, and the psychology of music, as John Sloboda has put it, finally comes of age. Cognitivism applied to music opens an extraordinarily fertile territory of research. The underlying idea is that listening to music is not a passive experience, a stimulus entering through the ear and producing an emotional reaction, but an active process of information processing involving mental representational structures, memory mechanisms, and operations of perceptual organization. The questions cognitive music psychology poses have a precision that aesthetic philosophy had never achieved. What is the nature of mental representations of music? How do we store it, remember it, recognize it? What processes are involved in musical production and in the comprehension of listening? And how and why do these mental representations give rise to aesthetic and emotional effects? That third question, the last, is the hardest, and the one on which research has made the least progress. Defining with scientific precision the nature of music's aesthetic and emotional effects remains, even today, one of the most fascinating open challenges in cognitive science. It is the point where number meets feeling, where Pythagoras meets Schopenhauer. In the final 2 decades of the 20th century, a further shift occurs. Neuroscience and biomedicine produce instruments, functional magnetic resonance imaging, high-resolution electroencephalography, computational models of the brain, that make it possible to study music no longer only as a subjective psychological experience, but as an objective, measurable, neurophysiological event. Connectionism emerges, a paradigm that abandons the mind as computer analogy of classical cognitivism and adopts instead the model of the neural network. The brain is not a processor executing sequential algorithms. It is a dynamic, parallel, distributed system in which thousands of interconnected nodes activate, inhibit, and reorganize themselves in response to musical stimuli. This perspective has profound implications. Since the properties at work in a neural network are essentially relational and quantitative, connections between nodes, activation weights, excitation levels, the connectionist paradigm is, by its very nature, mathematical. Sub-symbolic, but intrinsically numerical. The number returns, not as cosmic speculation, but as the architecture of the brain itself. From the intersection of neuroscience and music psychology, two relatively new disciplines emerge that are producing results of extraordinary interest. The first is the neuropsychology of music, the study of musical learning and processing in relation to the physiological functions of the brain. We know today, for example, that professional musicians have measurable structural differences in certain brain regions compared to non-musicians. That early musical training physically modifies neural connectivity. That reading a score and playing an instrument simultaneously activate brain areas normally associated with visual, motor, auditory, and linguistic processing. The second is music medicine, the study of the therapeutic effects of music on physical and psychological conditions. Organizations such as the International Society for Music in Medicine collate research showing that music can modulate hormonal secretion, reduce the perception of pain, accelerate neurological rehabilitation, and attenuate symptoms of anxiety and depression. This is not magic. It is not esotericism. It is physiology, the scientific demonstration of what the Pythagoreans had intuited. Music acts on body and mind through precise, measurable laws. The most ambitious and most debated contribution in this entire line of research is a generative theory of tonal music, published in 1983 by Fred Lerdahl and Ray Jackendorf, a book that has revolutionized and divided musicology, music psychology, and analytic philosophy of music. The core idea is powerful and, on first encounter, almost provocative. Understanding tonal music functions like a grammar. Just as the linguistic competence of a native speaker allows her to generate and comprehend grammatically correct sentences she has never encountered before, the musical competence of an experienced listener allows him to hierarchically organize a stream of sonic events, segmenting it into phrases, motifs, sections. According to implicit rules he cannot necessarily articulate, but applies unconsciously with extraordinary precision. The model is built on two types of rules. Well-formedness rules identify the possible musical structures. They are the grammar. Preference rules indicate the structures the listener tends to perceive as most natural, most coherent, most musically convincing. They are the laws of perception. The Lerdahl-Jackendorf model articulates the analysis of musical listening through 5 superimposed hierarchical levels, describing how the listener progressively organizes musical information from increasing complexity. The first level is the musical surface, individual sounds as perceived. The second is grouping structure, how sounds are grouped into motifs, phrases, sections. The third is metrical structure, how strong and weak beats organize themselves into a perceived meter. The fourth is time span reduction, which events are structurally more important than others in the temporal flow. The fifth is prolongational reduction, how harmonic tensions extend and resolve at a larger scale. The result is a representation of a musical work as a hierarchical tree, a structure visually similar to the syntactic trees of Chomsky's grammar, showing how levels of musical meaning are stratified and connected. This is not an analysis of emotion, It is an analysis of structure. It is mathematics applied to the perception of sound. Pythagoras, one imagines, would have found the diagrams immediately legible. The proportions are still there. They have simply acquired a new notation. The Lerdahl-Jackendorf theory has attracted criticism from every direction, and some of the most illuminating objections bear directly on our story. Roger Scruton raises two precise objections. The first, conceived as a generative grammar, the theory loses all force as a tool of musical criticism. A grammar describes all grammatically correct sentences of a language without judging them aesthetically. But a musical analysis that fails to distinguish between Beethoven and a first-year harmony exercise has lost something essential. The second, the model implies that the meaningful unit of listening is the complete work, which means it cannot adequately analyze improvised musical forms, oral traditions, or music without a score. Diana Raffman, by contrast, uses generative theory to propose an explanation of musical meaning, arguing that it is precisely within the hierarchical structures of listening that we find the key to understanding why certain music moves us and other music does not. The theory is not a ceiling, it is a floor. The debate continues, but the fact that it continues, on these terms, with these tools, is already a revolution relative to the musical discourse of the past. There is one question that this entire formidable scientific apparatus, psychophysics, cognitivism, connectionism, generative theory, has not yet answered. In fact, the apparatus makes the question more precise, more urgent, and in certain respects more mysterious than before. Why does music move us? Not in the vague, romantic sense, in the scientifically precise sense. What is the causal mechanism by which a sequence of air vibrations, organized according to hierarchical structures, analyzable with mathematical tools, produces in the human being emotional, hormonal, and neurological responses of extraordinary power? Why does a certain harmonic progression induce goosebumps? Why does a certain rhythm trigger involuntary movement? Why do certain intervals sound sad and others joyful, in ways that are transcultural and nearly universal? Stephen McAdams, one of the most important music psychologists working today, acknowledges honestly that this third area of research, musical emotion, is where science has made the least progress. Not for lack of interest, but because of the genuine difficulty of defining with scientific precision what an aesthetic and emotional effect actually is. This chapter is, in a certain sense, the chapter of hope. Not romantic hope, the kind that assigns to music the task of revealing the absolute. Scientific hope, the kind that believes in the possibility of genuinely understanding how music works. The journey we have followed in this audiobook, from Pythagoras to analytic philosophy, looked, for long stretches, like a story of progressive loss. The number, the cosmic harmony, the mathematical proportion had dissolved into romantic feeling, then into positivist formalism, then into analytic ontology. The Pythagorean question seemed lost for good. This chapter shows it is not. The psychology of music, neuroscience, and generative theory are reconstructing, with different methods and incomparably more powerful tools, the same project the Pythagoreans had. Understanding music as a system of laws, as a measurable structure, as a phenomenon that obeys principles, and that nonetheless produces in the human being something that no law on its own has yet managed to explain completely. That something is the point where science pauses and philosophy must resume speaking. And it is precisely the point from which the epilogue of this journey begins. Chapter 7. The Musical Brain. By the end of the 20th century, the philosophy of music finds itself in a curious position. It has sophisticated tools, analytic aesthetics, phenomenology, structuralism, Adorno's critical sociology. It has increasingly precise questions. But the central knot, what music is, how it exists, why it has the power it has, remains unresolved. More than that, it has multiplied. And then, from the 1990s onward, something changes in the very way philosophers pose the questions. One no longer asks, what is the essence of music? That question seems too large, too platonic, too bound to an idea of immutable truth that contemporary philosophy regards with growing unease. Instead, the question becomes, how does music concretely exist? Where does it live? In a score? In a performance? In a digital recording? In the memory of someone who once heard it? These questions seem more modest, but they lead much further than they appear. And they open a philosophical territory that Pythagoras would not have recognized, and yet in which his ghost continues to wander, tireless. The first great intellectual construction site of this period concerns ontology, a technical term that means simply the study of what exists and in what manner it exists. Applied to music, the question becomes, in what sense does Beethoven's Fifth Symphony exist? This is not an idle question. The score is a graphic trace on paper. The performance is a physical event that unfolds in time and then vanishes. The recording is a digital file, a sequence of bits. Yet we all say these are the same thing. How? Gerald Levinson, one of the most influential American philosophers of his generation, proposes an elegant and contested answer. A musical work is a sonically indicated structure, meaning it is inseparably tied to its historical context, its composer, the expressive means of its era. It is not an eternal, abstract object, as musical Platonism would have it. But neither is it a mere ephemeral physical event. It is something new, a kind of entity that exists only in relation to its history. Orpheus hovers over the argument. Structure matters, but it cannot exist outside time. Stephen Davies, a New Zealand philosopher, shifts attention toward performance. For Davies, the right question is not where a work abstractly resides, but how it functions within actual performance practice. His answer leads him to distinguish between works for performance, a symphony, which exists only when played, and works for listening, a recording, which exists as a fixed object. Andy Hamilton, for his part, uses jazz as his privileged philosophical case. Jazz is uncomfortable for classical theories of the musical work. It has no fixed score, it lives in improvisation, every performance is unique and unrepeatable. If you hold that a work is defined by its written text, jazz is not a work, or worse, it is an unfinished one. Hamilton rejects this conclusion. Jazz is not a marginal case. It is an alternative model of what music can be, a model in which Dionysus holds precise philosophical rights, not merely aesthetic ones. The Pythagorean misunderstanding proves still alive. There is still a persistent tendency to privilege the fixed structure, the score, the series, the law, over the unrepeatable sonic event. The debate between Levinson, Davies, and Hamilton is not merely a technical quarrel for specialists. It represents a shift in the very way philosophy thinks music, from object to event, from structure to process, from text to practice. This shift, which philosophers call the performative turn, carries enormous consequences. If music is fundamentally an event, then performance is not a translation of something that already exists. It is the place where music is summoned into existence each time. The musician does not execute a work, they create it, each time, irreversibly. And here, the category of Orpheus versus Dionysus reveals its full analytical weight. Orpheus, the musician-philosopher who knows the laws, who carries structure into sound, is no longer sufficient on his own. Dionysus, sound as pure event, as a force that overwhelms form, cannot be dismissed as irrational chaos. The tension between them is not a defect of musical theory, it is its constitutive condition. The misunderstanding was never choosing Pythagoras over Dionysus. It was believing one had to choose. Meanwhile, a quiet revolution moves through cognitive science and philosophy of mind. It is called inactivism, from the verb to enact, and it maintains something apparently obvious but philosophically explosive. Cognition is not something that happens only in the brain. It involves the whole body and its dynamic relationship with the environment. Applied to music, inactivism, developed among others by Mark Johnson and researchers such as Mark Lehman, produces a precise thesis. We do not listen to music with our ears, we listen with our entire body. Rhythmic perception is not an abstract mental process. It is restrained movement, muscular tension, a motor impulse that responds to sound before consciousness has processed any concept whatsoever. This means that musical experience is fundamentally embodied. There is no pure listener who receives sonic information and decodes it according to rules. There is a body that responds, vibrates, anticipates, and moves even when standing still. Dionysus was right about this. Sound does not reach the mind through the ear. It reaches the body through everything. In parallel with enactivism, neuroscience enters the philosophical debate about music with considerable force. Daniel Levitin, neuroscientist and musician, in his widely read 2006 book, This Is Your Brain on Music, describes how the brain processes sound, how harmonic anticipation activates reward circuits, how music shares neural pathways with language, and yet differs from it in significant ways. Anirudh Patel, in his Music, Language and the Brain of 2008, constructs a systematic comparative analysis between music and language, identifying shared structures and irreducible specificities. All of this is fascinating, but the philosopher must ask an uncomfortable question. Does knowing which neurons fire when we listen to Bach tell us something essential about what music is? Is the neuroscientific reduction, explaining music in terms of cerebral patterns, an answer to the philosophical question, or an answer to a different question entirely? Pythagoras identified the numerical proportions of sound. Neuroscience identifies the numerical proportions of the brain. The problem remains the same. Whoever makes music is not a brain. It is a person living in the world. At this point in our history, it is worth pausing for a provisional reckoning. 2,000 years of the philosophy of music, from the ancient Greeks to contemporary neuroscientists. And the fundamental dualism, what we have called Orpheus against Dionysus, has not been resolved. It has transformed itself, refined itself, multiplied into ever-new variations. But the knot is the same. In contemporary analytic philosophy, Levinson against Platonist theories of the work, eternal ideal structure against historically situated event. In cognitive science, the computational theory of mind that treats music as information processing against enactivism that relocates it in the body and in action. In aesthetics, those who defend the autonomy of musical structure against those who claim the primacy of experience. Orpheus against Dionysus. Always the same confrontation. Always the same two poles. The history seems to turn in circles. Yet there is something that none of these theories has yet brought into focus. Not the tension between the two, that is visible, but what that tension presupposes. Something that is neither structure nor ecstasy, neither number nor body. Something that makes both possible. But that is the last chapter. From the 1990s onward, an entirely new field emerges within the philosophy of music. The ethics of listening. The question is no longer whether music is beautiful or ugly, authentic or inauthentic. Those are aesthetic questions. The question becomes, who has the right to make this music? Who has the right to listen to it? What happens when a musical tradition is used by someone who does not belong to it? Cultural appropriation, the technical term for the use of elements from one culture by members of another, typically more powerful one, has become one of the philosophically most thorny questions of our time. When Elvis Presley brought African-American blues to mass white audiences in the 1950s, did he do something wrong? When African, Indian, or Latin American musical traditions are incorporated into global pop, who gains and who loses? These questions have a deeply philosophical structure. They touch on cultural identity, power, the ownership of an expressive tradition. And they show that music is never merely sound. It is always also history, community, social body. Dionysus here has a political face that Nietzsche had not foreseen. There is another frontier that the philosophy of music crosses with increasing decisiveness from the 1990s onward: sound studies. Not music understood as the art of notes, but sound as an environmental, cultural, and political phenomenon. R. Murray Schafer, Canadian composer and theorist, had already in the 1970s coined the concept of soundscape, the acoustic environment understood as an aesthetic and political dimension of human experience. Industrial noise, traffic, the silence of a forest. All of this is sound, and all of it shapes how we inhabit the world. John Cage had done the same thing from within art music, with his celebrated 4 minutes and 33 seconds. 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence in which the audience listens to the incidental sounds of the hall, the world, their own bodies. The message is radical. Every sound is music if there is someone who listens to it attentively. The borders between music and non-music, between art and environment, between intentional and accidental, dissolve. The Pythagorean misunderstanding, music as a set of precise numerical relations between defined sounds, is challenged at its very root. No serious reflection on the philosophy of music in the 21st century can ignore the radical transformation produced by digital technologies. Streaming, instantaneous global distribution, recommendation algorithms, music generated by artificial intelligence. These phenomena are not merely technical changes, they are ontological changes. They alter the mode in which music exists and circulates in the world. The concept of ubiquitous music describes a condition in which music is constantly available, in every place, at every hour, personalized by algorithms that learn our tastes and return them to us amplified. We no longer seek music, music finds us. We no longer choose what to hear. A recommendation system chooses for us, optimizing engagement rather than necessarily the quality of the experience. Adorno would have had much to say about this, and much of his critique of the culture industry would apply still with surgical precision. But there is also something Adorno did not foresee: the radical democratization of musical production. Anyone today with a smartphone and an app can record, produce, and distribute music globally. The musician-philosopher of Orpheus and the instinctive player of Dionysus now live in the same pocket device. And then there is artificial intelligence. Systems for automatic music generation, from Iva to Suno, from Udio to Music Gen, are today capable of producing convincing music in any style, on demand, in a matter of seconds. This poses a philosophical question of historical proportions. Who composes when a machine composes? On one side, the Pythagorean answer is tempting. AI demonstrates that music really is reducible to numerical patterns, to statistical structures, to probabilistic relations between sonic elements. If a machine can generate plausible music simply by analyzing millions of examples and interpolating between them, perhaps the Pythagoreans were right. Music is, at bottom, mathematics. But this answer is too hasty. What AI music systems produce today is technically sophisticated and philosophically hollow. It is sound that has the form of music without its substance. What is missing is intention, body, personal history. What is missing, in a word, is Orpheus, the musician who knows the numerical laws but passes through them with his own life. AI-generated music is Pythagoras without Orpheus. And it is precisely this that renders it, for now, philosophically insufficient as music, even when it is aesthetically persuasive. Here we are at the end of this long journey. From Pythagoras' monochord to artificial intelligence algorithms, from number as the essence of the cosmos to performance as an unrepeatable event, from Gregorian chant to personalized streaming, what have we found? We have found that the original misunderstanding, treating music as though it were only a system of numerical relations, or as though it were only a subjective emotional experience, has never been resolved. It has multiplied, refined itself, disguised itself as analytic ontology, as neuroscience, as ethics of listening, as artificial intelligence. But the knot is always the same. Music is the place where number meets body, where law meets event, where Orpheus meets Dionysus. It is neither one nor the other. It is the tension between them, a tension that cannot be resolved, that must not be resolved, because it is precisely that tension which makes music so powerful, so necessary, so irreducibly human. The philosophical misunderstanding was not an error to be corrected. It was the symptom of something deeper, the constitutive difficulty of thinking structure and life together, number and body, order and chaos. The philosophy of music, when equal to its object, does not resolve this tension. It inhabits it. As Orpheus descended into the underworld, knowing the laws and carrying his lyre. Chapter 8. Beyond the Number. We have travelled far, from Pythagoras' monochord to Lerdahl and Jackendorf's generative grammar, from the harmony of the spheres to Spotify's algorithms. And at every stage of this journey, the same unresolved knot has returned, in ever new forms. Is music structure, or is it experience? Is it number, or is it body? Is it law, or is it event? Philosophers have chosen, each in their time, one pole or the other. Pythagoras, the number. Schopenhauer, feeling. Hanslick, form. Wagner, ecstasy. Goodman, the code. Levinson, history. None of them entirely wrong, none of them entirely right. And this is not a failure of philosophy. It is a signal that the problem was badly framed from the beginning. The misunderstanding was not choosing the number over the body, it was believing that a choice was necessary. Believing that music was, in its deepest essence, one or the other. Whereas music, as we will see, is precisely the place where that choice becomes impossible. Necessarily impossible. One philosopher came closer than any other to grasping the structure of this problem. Nietzsche, in 1872, with The Birth of Tragedy. His intuition was correct. Every great art is born from an irresolvable tension between two opposing impulses. Apollo and Dionysus, form and ecstasy, the sculpted image and the orgiastic dance. But Nietzsche was thinking about art in general, about Greek tragedy in particular. And when his schema was applied to music, something failed to hold. Apollo, god of light, of visible form, of solar measure, is not a musician. He does not know the laws of sound from within. He is an external legislator, not a performer. He is the geometer of the cosmos, not the player of the lyre. For music, Apollo is not enough. The Nietzschean pair is powerful as a general schema, but to think about music specifically, another figure is needed. A figure that has Apollo's precision and Dionysus's carnality together. A figure that knows the laws and crosses them with the body. That figure exists. Careful, we are not talking about the myth, not the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, the descent into the underworld, the forbidden glance. We are talking about Orpheus as a philosophical category, as a conceptual structure. as a name for something that the philosophy of music has not yet named with precision. In tradition, Orpheus is the musician par excellence, not because he plays well, Dionysus plays, the Sileni play, but because he knows the laws of what he plays. Pythagoras, in legend, learns the music of the spheres. Orpheus embodies it. The difference is decisive. He does not observe the structure from outside. He traverses it from within. And this is the philosophical move that changes everything. Orpheus is not the opposite of Dionysus. He is not the rational pole opposed to the ecstatic pole. He is something different and more radical, the figure that makes the tension between the two possible. Dionysus dissolves the individual in the sonic flux. Apollo constructs the form in the immobile instant. Orpheus creates the rhythm that permits the passage between dissolution and form, between flux and structure, between note and silence. Let us try to say this as precisely as possible, even at the cost of a formulation that may seem paradoxical. Orpheus is the note and the silence together. Not the note, not the silence, but the relation between them, the relation that makes them music instead of noise, instead of void. The note without the silence is continuous noise. The silence without the note is emptiness. But the rhythm, the pulse between note and silence, between sound and the absence of sound, is what the body recognizes as music before the mind has elaborated any harmonic or melodic concept. This is the precise philosophical meaning of the figure of Orpheus. Rhythm as mediation between structure and body, between number and flesh. Not structure alone, that is Pythagoras. Not body alone, that is Dionysus. But the passage between the two, the threshold, the moment when number becomes pulse and pulse becomes meaning. 2,000 years of the philosophy of music have tried to stand on one side of that threshold. Orpheus is the threshold. From this position, the three great themes running through contemporary philosophy of music appear in a different light. The first is the question of the body. Inactivism, which we encountered in the previous chapter, has shown that musical listening is not a cognitive act separate from physical experience. We do not listen to music with our ears, we listen with the whole body. Rhythmic perception is restrained movement, muscular tension, motor impulse. But inactivism stops at a threshold. It describes the mechanism well, how the body responds to sound, but it does not explain why that response takes the form it takes. Why certain rhythms make the body move and others do not. Why a certain syncopation produces an expectation that resolves in movement, while another produces disorientation. The answer does not lie in the body alone. It lies in the relation between numerical structure and bodily response. It lies, in other words, in rhythm as mediation. The body does not respond to sound in a raw way. It responds to pulse, to proportion, to interval. It responds to what the sound does in time. It responds to Orpheus, not to Dionysus. The second theme is more radical and touches something that the philosophy of music has almost always treated as a given rather than as a problem. Rhythm is not a property of sound. It is a relation between sound and listener, between structure and body. It does not exist in the acoustic signal independently of perception. It exists in the encounter between a sequence of sonic events and a nervous system that interprets it as pulse. This means that rhythm is fundamentally relational. It does not belong to the music. It does not belong to the listener. It happens between them. It is a threshold event. And it is precisely for this reason that it is impossible to reduce music to number alone. Because the number describes the structure of the signal, but does not describe the event of rhythm. The sequence 101010 is numerically identical whether you play it at 100 beats per minute or at 200. But at 100, the body walks. At 200, the body runs. The structure is the same. The music is different. And it is equally impossible to reduce music to body alone, because the body responds to structure, not to noise, to proportion, not to chaos. Rhythm as mediation is the only category that holds both together without cancelling either. It is worth returning briefly to Goodman and Levinson, the philosophers who more than any others have dominated the debate on the ontology of the musical work. Goodman defines the musical work as a class of performances compliant with a score. Levinson defines it as a sonically indicated structure, historically situated. Both definitions are analytically robust. Both leave out the same thing. They leave it out because they lack the tools to include it. That thing is rhythm as relational event. The fact that two performances can be compliant with the same score, consistent with the same historical context, and produce radically different experiences depending on how the rhythm is embodied by the performer and received by the listener's body. Furtwängler and Karajan conduct the same Beethoven fifth. The notes are the same, the tempos are similar. And yet, anyone who knows both interpretations knows they are not the same music. Not because the notes differ, but because the breath differs, the pulse differs, the rhythm differs, and the rhythm is not in the score. The third theme brings us back to the present, and it is the most urgent. AI-based music generation systems, Suno, Udio, MusicGen, and many others, are now capable of producing technically convincing music in any style, on demand, in seconds. This fact places the philosophy of music before a question it can no longer defer. If music is reducible to numerical structure, the AI algorithms have already won. They demonstrate that it is enough to analyze millions of examples, extract the statistical patterns, recombine them with sufficient complexity, and the result is music. Pythagoras was right, the number is enough. But is it? Anyone who listens carefully to AI-generated music recognizes something strange. Not a technical flaw, it is often technically impeccable, but an absence of expectation, an absence of unresolved tension, an absence of rhythm in the philosophical sense we have just defined. Not pulse, but relation. AI music sounds. It does not breathe. What is missing from AI-generated music is not complexity, not variety, not even, necessarily, beauty in the superficial sense of the term. What is missing is the body that decided that pause. Every pause in human music is a decision. Not in a deliberate, conscious sense. The musician does not calculate, but in the sense that the pause is born from a nervous system that has lived in time, that has learned to expect, that carries in the sound the physical trace of that expectation. Furtwängler makes that pause in the second movement because he carries in his body the entire tradition of that music. And that tradition enters his breathing, his hands, his baton. The algorithm produces the pause because the training data shows that there is usually a pause there. That is not the same thing. Not because the algorithm is less intelligent, but because the algorithm has no body that inhabits time. It has a model of time. The model is Pythagoras. The body is Orpheus. Generative music is Pythagoras without Orpheus. There is another contemporary form of the problem worth naming, even if it seems more sociological than philosophical. Music streaming, Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, has changed the way music exists in the time of daily life. Ubiquitous music is music without waiting, without the moment of silence that precedes deliberate, sought, desired listening. The pause that gave the note its meaning has been replaced by a continuous flow. And continuous flow, however technically rich, tends to reduce music to background. This is not a moral judgment, it is a structural observation. When music is always present, the contrast that creates the rhythm of listening fades. Orpheus needs silence in order to play. Not absolute silence, that is an abstraction, but relative silence, the absence that makes presence possible, the pause that makes the note possible. When silence disappears from daily experience, what disappears is not only rest. What disappears is the condition of possibility for rhythm as relation. Orpheus disappears. What remains is Dionysus, the flow, the intoxication, the consumption. There is one musical practice that tests these ideas with particular sharpness: improvisation. Jazz improvisation, or that of Indian, African, Middle Eastern traditions, is the place where rhythm as mediation is most visible. The musician improvises on a given harmonic structure, the fragments we have, the chord scheme, and within that structure inserts the unrepeatable event of his bodily presence. The notes chosen, the pauses built, the tension and release. All of this happens in real time, in a body that inhabits that structure from within. An algorithm can improvise in the technical sense. It can generate variations on a schema in real time, but it cannot risk. And risk is a constitutive part of human improvisation. The pause that lasts a moment too long, the sound that arrives ahead of time, the harmonic tension that does not resolve when expected. That risk arises from the fact that the musician has a body that can err, that can surprise itself. The algorithm is never surprised. And this incapacity for surprise is precisely the absence of Orpheus. At this point, we can sketch what this book has attempted to build, chapter by chapter. Not a theory of music in the technical sense, but something more fundamental. A proposal about the philosophical place in which music resides. Music is not number. Not because the number does not describe it, it does, with extraordinary precision. But because description is not habitation. Pythagoras described music from the outside as the physicist describes the fall of bodies. Orpheus inhabits it from within, as the body inhabits gravity every time it takes a step. Music is not pure subjective experience either. Not because experience does not matter. It does. It is irreducible. But because experience without structure is noise, not music. Dionysus without Orpheus is the party, not the song. Music is embodied rhythm, the numerical structure lived in the time of a body that waits, that anticipates, that is surprised. It is the note that knows it will be followed by a pause. It is the pause that still carries within itself the sound just ended. It is Orpheus, the musician who knows the laws and crosses them with his own life. Let us return to the question that opened this chapter, the one that AI music generation has made suddenly urgent. If the number is enough, why does music continue to be experience? The answer now is more precise. The number is not enough because music is not only structure, it is inhabited structure. And habitation requires a body, a memory, an expectation. It requires lived time, not calculated time. The algorithm calculates time. The musician inhabits it. And between calculating and inhabiting lies the same distance as between the map and the territory, between the score and the concert, between the formula of falling and the moment when the body touches the ground. That distance is Orpheus, not as myth, not as poetic image, as the philosophical category that describes what music does when it goes beyond the number without abandoning it, when it transforms law into rhythm, rhythm into body, body into listening. When music was a number, only this was missing. Epilogue, the misunderstanding and the gift. We left from a shore, and we return to the same shore. But the person who returns is not the same person who left, and the shore itself looks different, now that we know what lies on the other side. We have crossed 2,000 years of thought about music. We have watched an extraordinary intuition, music as the manifestation of number, as a window onto the mathematical laws of the universe, be progressively abandoned, first for theological reasons, then aesthetic ones, then ontological ones. we have watched another intuition take its place. Music as the language of feeling, as subjective experience, as one art among the arts, that dominated for centuries, producing both immense masterworks and philosophical confusions of comparable scale. And we have watched science in the 20th century begin to recover the lost thread, not with the cosmic speculation of the Pythagoreans, but with the experimental apparatus of psychoacoustics, neurology, and generative theory. The number has returned, in a white coat this time, but it has returned. Before we take our leave, it is worth looking at the whole map, because the history we have told is not only a history of ideas, it is the history of a mechanism that Western civilization has always used to advance its thinking, producing oppositions in order to generate more precise distinctions. At every stage of the journey, musical thought has produced a pair of opposites: intelligible music against audible music, musici against cantores, form against content, Schoenberg against Stravinsky, algorithm against body, and behind all these pairs, always the same primordial tension, the one this audiobook has called Orpheus against Dionysus, the structure that knows the laws of sound against the ecstasy that dissolves into sound. But saying against, as we are about to see, is not yet precise enough. Here lies the subtlest and most important point of the entire story we have told. The Orphic Dionysian dualism is not a defect of Western thought about music. It is not an error to be corrected, a contradiction to be resolved. It is the engine of that thought itself. Every time one of the two poles appears to have won, every time formalism seems to have definitively buried expressionism, or vice versa, a new current emerges from the other side to put the opposite back in play. Positivism flattens romanticism? Wagner arrives to reclaim Dionysus. Hanslick imposes formalism? Nietzsche arrives to reinstate the inseparable pair. 12-tone music freezes feeling inside the series. Minimalism arrives to reintroduce breath, repetition, trance. Music, in this sense, does not need the dualism to be resolved. It needs it to remain alive, productive, generative. Like the dissonance that does not resolve into consonance, but lives inside it, creating tension and movement. Having said all this, the misunderstanding was real, and it is precisely locatable. It does not consist in having chosen feeling over number or form over content. It consists in having forgotten the original question. The question the Pythagoreans had posed with extraordinary clarity, and that subsequent centuries progressively buried under layers of aesthetics, ontology, and literary criticism. Why does music have the power it has? Not in the vague, romantic sense, because it moves us, because it elevates us, because it puts us in contact with the divine. In that romantic sense, the question is legitimate, but tends to stop at wonder, without proceeding toward explanation. In the integrated scientific philosophical sense, what is the mechanism, physical, neurological, cognitive, cultural, by which a structure of numerical ratios between sound frequencies produces in the human being effects of such magnitude? This question is neither purely scientific nor purely philosophical. It is both simultaneously. And it is the question Pythagoras had already intuited, even if he lacked the tools to answer it. It would be ungenerous and historically inaccurate to complain that 2,000 years of philosophy of music ignored the right question. In truth, they did not ignore it. They lacked the tools to answer it. And those tools were built slowly, through exactly those centuries of aesthetics, criticism, and ontology that we have described. Today, we know things Pythagoras could not have known. We know that the octave, the 2-to-1 ratio the Pythagoreans considered the most perfect of intervals, produces in the human brain a measurable and universal neurological response, independent of culture. We know that musical rhythm synchronizes biological rhythms, cardiac, respiratory, neural. We know that certain harmonic intervals activate the brain's reward system with the same efficacy as other primary, pleasurable stimuli. Pythagoras was right. Music is mathematics that the body recognizes. But the depth of that truth is far more radical than even he could have imagined. It is not the abstract mind that recognizes the numbers. It is the whole body, its cells, its neurons, its vital rhythms, that responds to sonic proportions as if it had always known them. And we know something still more radical, which the enactivist philosophy of the last 2 decades has made explicit. We do not listen to music with our ears, we listen with our entire body. Musical understanding is not a mental process that occurs after sonic perception. It is an embodied action, a physical response that precedes any conceptual elaboration. On this point, Dionysus had the right answer before neuroscience found the evidence. Allow me, at this final point, to step outside the narrator's voice for a moment and speak in the first person. Because this journey is not only academic, at least not for me. When I wrote the thesis that underlies this audiobook in 1999, I was a young philosopher with an unresolved tension between speculation and music. I had founded a band some years earlier, I played drums, I lived music from the inside while trying to think about it from the outside. That double belonging always made me feel the inadequacy of the philosophical answers available. Too abstract for someone who knows what it feels like to chase a groove in a rehearsal room. Too sentimental for someone who knows the geometry of a chord progression. The thesis was my attempt to understand why. Why the philosophy of music always seemed to be talking about something other than what music actually is, actually does, actually produces in those who play it and those who listen. The answer I found, the misunderstanding, the lost question, the forgotten number, is not a complete answer. It is a direction, and a direction, sometimes, is already everything. If I were to condense into a few essential ideas what this journey has tried to show, I would say this. First, music is, before everything else, and more deeply than anything else, a physical, mathematical phenomenon. The numerical proportions the Pythagoreans discovered, and that modern acoustic physics has confirmed with a precision they could not have imagined, are real, measurable, universal. They are not a cosmic metaphor. They are the structure of sound. Second, that structure produces in human beings cognitive, emotional, and neurological effects of extraordinary power. The exact mechanism of this transduction, from physical vibration to subjective experience, remains largely mysterious. And it is precisely in that mystery that philosophy, science, and art meet, rather than excluding one another. Third, the fact that for 2,000 years, Western culture predominantly thought of music as art rather than science is not a clean loss. It was the way that culture explored the subjective dimension of the musical phenomenon, its capacity to move, to signify, to connect people. This too is knowledge. This too is real. There is one final step to take. Not a step backward toward literature or symbol, but a step forward toward the theoretical conclusion that this entire history made inevitable. Orpheus descends into the underworld. He finds Eurydice. He leads her toward the light with the sole force of music, with the rhythm of his lyre holding together the time of the journey and the silence of death. And then he turns, and everything dissolves. For centuries, this gesture has been read as the tragedy of love, as human weakness before the divine, as a symbol of loss. But there is another reading, more precise philosophically. Orpheus turns because he cannot do otherwise, because the rhythm that holds the journey together requires the turning, the pause, the interruption, the moment in which structure yields to event. It is not an error. It is the nature of music itself. It cannot last forever without transforming. The sound that never ends is not music, it is noise. And here we can finally formulate the thesis that this journey has been attempting to build. Not as an academic claim, but as an answer to the question the Pythagoreans posed and that no one had answered to the end. Orpheus does not represent order against chaos. He represents the rhythm that makes their alternation possible. Dionysus dissolves, Apollo, or Pythagoras, constructs. But without the rhythm that governs the passage between dissolution and construction, there is no music. There is only chaos on one side and schema on the other. Orpheus is the threshold between the two, not the wall that separates them, the door that puts them in communication. And this is a definition of music, not the only possible definition, but perhaps the most precise that can be given without betraying either the number or the body, either the structure or the experience. Music is the embodied rhythm that makes possible the alternation between order and dissolution. It is the passage itself. It is Orpheus walking through the underworld with his lyre. Orpheus is where a longer inquiry begins, a working hypothesis that unfolds elsewhere in a more technical register. There is one thing music does that no other form of human knowledge is able to do in the same way. It exists simultaneously on multiple levels: physical, mathematical, cognitive, emotional, social, cultural, without any of these levels exhausting it or reducing it to the others. It is number, and it is not only number. It is feeling, and it is not only feeling. It is structure, and it is not only structure. This irreducibility is its greatness. And it is also the reason why the philosophy of music is probably the most difficult and most fascinating of all philosophies of art. Because everyone who has genuinely tried to think it, from Pythagoras to Goodman, from Plato to Adorno, has had to reckon with something that always exceeds, by a little but decisively, their capacity for explanation. That excess has a name. It is called rhythm. Thank you for listening.